Greetings. A while back in a previous video, I discussed the Ge'ez translation of the opening verse of the 22nd Psalm, along with a bunch of other translations of that verse. And since then, I've been thinking that I might want to make more videos discussing the Ge'ez translation of different biblical passages, sharing details which I personally find interesting. And, now it's a new year. Christmas for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is today, at least while I'm recording this. It might pass by the time I get it up. So perhaps now is a good time to get into that. So with that in mind, in this video, I want to discuss the features of specifically the Ge'ez translation of Genesis 1:3. And that's the text you see at the top of your screen. It reads, Vayibeh Igziabher leyekun birhan v'kone birhan. And of course, as you know, that translates to, anyone who's familiar with the English translation, that's pretty much the same. It translates to, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. More specifically, you might translate this, and the Lord of the world said, let there be light, and there was light. So now, I want to take a look at the structure of this verse, and as I said, I want to discuss its different parts, its various elements, and, touch on some things which I find interesting. And I'm going to compare it with statements and words that appear in other texts, perhaps with the focus mainly on Arabic. So to begin with the easiest part, the first letter, where this is the conjunction prefix to the first word. It's the equivalent of the English word and, right? And then from there we move to the verb, yibeh. Now this verb here and the way it's written, this is one of the primary reasons why I wanted to make this video, as constructions like this are all over the Ge'ez translation of the Bible. And this sort of construction can initially provide an interesting experience for new students of Ge'ez. You see, if you come to a study of Ge'ez already possessing a familiarity with the grammar of other Semitic languages like Hebrew or Arabic or Aramaic, there's a lot that's going to look familiar to you. But like with all languages, you're also going to encounter things which might not play according to the basic rules that you might be expecting. So for example, once you get past the difference in script, a familiarity with the verb forms and verb conjugations in another Semitic language like Arabic or Hebrew will enable you to quickly recognize a lot of the verbal constructions in Ge'ez. You'll often be able to know how to look past the prefixes and suffixes of a verb construction and quickly figure out the triliteral root of that particular verb. However, with this verb here on your screen, it's two letters, the equivalent of yod and bet in Hebrew or ya and ba in Arabic. So trying to infer what root is here can initially make for a maddening experience for the new student of Ge'ez, even if they come to the table with, a pre-existing familiarity with other Semitic languages. You'll notice that I have on the screen that the form is technically imperfect. Now, as a disclaimer, it's functioning like a form in the perfect tense, but it's nonetheless rooted in the structure of the imperfect. So for those familiar with other Semitic languages, that initial letter, equivalent to a Hebrew yod or an Arabic ya, is the standard prefix in the third person singular imperfect, which means that that initial letter is not part of the root. So that leaves you with just a single letter for the root, just that B, just that equivalent of the bet or ba. Hence why I said that, a new student of Ge'ez might find the process of determining the root in this case to be just a wee bit frustrating, perhaps even maddening. So it turns out that the root is bahala, right? And thus the third person imperfect with, the typical suffix found in other Semitic languages would look something like this. Not necessarily in this precise vocalization, but this string of consonants, right? However, Ge'ez has this irregular form for the verb, where not one, but two of the root letters drop off. Now, those who are familiar with other Semitic languages can easily think of a bunch of instances where one weak root letter might drop off in certain verbal constructions. And in fact, we're going to look at that, we're going to see a couple of examples of that when we get into the verb to be. But two root letters dropping off can be a new experience for students of other Semitic languages. And although this form is derived from the structure of the imperfect, in this case, it's used for the perfect tense, which is to say the completed tense, or akin to the past tense. And you can see this process get discussed in a few places in August Dillmann and Carl Bezold's Ethiopic Grammar. And here I'm showing pages from Crichton's English translation of that work. And I'll give a full reference to this work in the video description. But I'm also showing some excerpts here. And interested viewers, if they want, they can slow down or pause the video, if they want to take a closer look at a particular page. Now, in that work, page 179 is perhaps the most relevant, or for those who are using a different edition where the page numbers are different, this would be section 92. But whatever the case, the point of all that buildup was to note that this is the verb to say, functioning as a third-person singular perfect tense, and thus Eʋegbe means he said. So Eʋegbe means and he said, right? Now, moving on from that, the second word is እግዚአብሔር, right? The standard word for Lord, or God in a sense. And this is found all over the Ge'ez translation of the Bible. And it's actually a compound of two words, Igzi, which itself means Lord, and Beher, which can mean a specific place, but can also mean the world. So I would take this Ge'ez word, እግዚአብሔር, as being equivalent to the Hebrew phrase, Adon Olam. And then we get to the verb, leyikun. Now, this verb means to be, right? And it corresponds to a similar verb in Arabic, which I'll be touching on later in this video. And quick note on the consonantal structure here. Seeing that L prefix, that lam prefix or lamed prefix, some students of Hebrew might be tempted to wonder if this is an infinitive, though that might fit awkwardly as the verb is otherwise it's in the imperfect form, after that lam prefix. The reality is that in Ge'ez, this prefix can be used to convey the imperative, which is to say, to convey a command. So, leyikun means let there be. It's a command to be. It's a command for something to come into existence. And you can find this sort of imperative lam prefix in Arabic as well, where, you'll have a verb rendered in the imperfect, and then there's the lam prefix to put in the imperative. And, that appears in a bunch of Quranic verses, and so too in the 19th century Van Dyck Arabic translation of this very biblical verse. But that aside, the next word is birhan, which means light. And I'm going to circle back to this word a bit later in the video, perhaps at the end of the video. And after that, we come to wekone. That first letter is the conjunction. And then we again find the verb to be. That's the same verb we looked at just a moment ago, though this time it's in a simple perfect form. It's in essentially the past tense. So this means, and there was. And then we come to the end of the verse where we find again the word birhan, which, as I noted a moment ago, means light. So that's the structure of the verse. Basically, like I said, you could translate this, and the Lord of the world said, let there be light. And there was light. Like I said, I want to compare this to some other texts, and perhaps with the focus mostly on Arabic. So on your screen now is the opening page of what is known as the Taj. It's a Yemeni edition of the Torah, which puts the Hebrew text side by side with the ancient Aramaic translation of Onkelos and the 10th century Judeo-Arabic translation of Sa'adi al-Gaon. So here's Genesis 1:3 in this particular text, in the Taj. First, we have the Hebrew text of the verse, which many of you are familiar with, Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or, Vayehu Or. And then we have the Aramaic translation of Onkelos, which reads, Wa'amar Adonai, or Wa'amar Yah, however you wish to pronounce that double yod standing in place of the tetragrammaton. But Wa'amar Adonai, Yehe Nehora, Wahawa Nehora. And then we get to the Judeo-Arabic translation of Sa'adi al-Gaon, known as Tafsir Rasag, and with Rasag being an acronym for Rabbeinu Sa'adi al-Gaon. And it reads, Fasha Allah an yakun nur, fakana nur. And a quick side note, you might notice that Allah is spelled with Judeo-Arabic's Alif Lam ligature, which combines the Aleph and Lamed into a single character, which is something that has been discussed and mentioned briefly in some of my previous videos, like my video on the Solitreo Quran. Now, if we can, I'd like to compare that Judeo-Arabic translation of Genesis 1:3 to the Ge'ez translation of Genesis 1:3. And I didn't include the prefix fa at the start of the Judeo-Arabic translation, so perhaps I should have. Also, I expanded the Alif Lam ligature in Allah out to a distinct aleph and lamed. And for those not familiar with the Hebrew script, that text in the corresponding Arabic characters would be as follows. Now, I colored the Hamza in a slightly lighter gray because there isn't a corresponding character in the Judeo-Arabic text. For whatever reason, Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic written in the Hebrew text, never sets aside a character or a mark to represent the Hamza, where a Hamza would appear in a standard Arabic text. Now, at this point, we have 3 different scripts on the screen. So in an attempt to make this easier, I'll transcribe the Ge'ez characters into the corresponding Latin characters. And now, as a disclaimer, this only captures the consonants, not how they're vocalized. And now I'll transcribe the Judeo-Arabic text into the corresponding Latin characters. And again, this is just capturing the consonants, not their vocalization. And I'm doing this so that way those who aren't familiar with one or more of these scripts can nonetheless compare their consonantal structures. Now, I should also note that the transcription of the Ge'ez text is running from left to right, while the transcription of the Judeo-Arabic text is running from right to left. So, they're going in different directions, and I understand and I appreciate that that might initially be a little confusing to see the Latin text. You're trying to compare the consonantal structures, even if you're just going by the Latin script, and, it can be a little confusing if they're going in opposite directions, but I did it that way to help visualize that these 2 Semitic languages are written in different directions. The Ge'ez script is written from left to right, while the Hebrew script used here to convey Arabic goes from right to left. That said, we can now compare the 2 texts. We begin with the verb, right? The opening verb. And actually, as I mentioned earlier, both began with a prefix. The Ge'ez text begins with the standard conjunction that's found across all Semitic languages, wa, while the Judeo-Arabic text began with a prefixed fa, which in Arabic conveys a meaning along the lines of then. But the prefixes aside, each text begins with a verb. However, the Ge'ez text employs the verb to say, while the Arabic text employs the verb to will or to want or to intend. For example, when you hear people say inshallah, for God willing, the sha'a part is the same verb you see here, right? So inshallah literally means if God willed. So where the Ge'ez text has God saying or commanding that there be light, the Judeo-Arabic translation states that God willed that there will be light. It's a subtle difference. The second word in each case is a reference to God. As I've mentioned earlier, the Ge'ez text employs Eʋegbe, which, as I mentioned earlier, literally means Lord of the world, while the Arabic text employs the word Allah, literally meaning God or the God, the God of Abraham, the one true God, you might say. And I'm tempted to skip over the third word in the Arabic text, which is an, which means that. In other words, the text reads, Shah Allah an, God willed that. I'm tempted to say it doesn't really have an exact parallel in the Ge'ez text, but let's first look at the verbs for to be. They're basically the same, though the Arabic text has an extra wa, as I guess you could say it's as a mater lectionis, conveying a longer vowel, but the verbs are nonetheless basically the same. Yakun, which is the verb to be in the third person imperfect. So even though this verse is rendered here into 2 different languages, using 2 different scripts, going in opposite directions, at the center of each text is the same verb, from a common Semitic root, a root which is common to both languages. It's the root for the verb to be, rendered in the imperfect, yakun. As I noted earlier, the Ge'ez verb is preceded by a lam prefix to turn it into a command, while the Judeo-Arabic is preceded by the word an, which is used for the subjunctive. And while I've described the verb here in the Ge'ez text as being in the imperative, perhaps others might want to argue that it's subtly akin to a subjunctive, or that such a prefix on the imperfect can at times convey a subjunctive. But whatever the case, we know that in the Ge'ez text, God is commanding light to exist, and the Judeo-Arabic text states that God willed that the light exist. And skipping for a moment over the respective words for light, I want to jump to the next verb. And again, it's from the same root. In both cases, it's the verb to be in the third person singular perfect tense, literally meaning he or it existed. Once again, they're basically the same verb, though basically the same spelling, though the Arabic text has a more explicit vocalization with an alif in the center. Each has a prefix, the Ge'ez text having the common and standard Semitic conjunction, which I mentioned earlier, wa, meaning and, while the Arabic fa, as I mentioned earlier, means then, right? And then in both cases, we have the respective words for light. The Ge'ez text uses the word birhan twice, while the Judeo-Arabic text uses the standard Arabic word for light, which is nur, uses nur twice. In both texts, each instance of the word light, whether birhan or nur, each instance of the word light comes after each use of the verb to be, first in the imperfect tense and then in the perfect tense. So essentially, both texts say there will be light and then there was light. Having shown that, I'd like to take the Judeo-Arabic text off the screen and now show a different Arabic phrase. And I can likewise transcribe the consonantal structure of that Arabic phrase into the corresponding Latin characters. And once again, the Latin transcriptions are moving in opposite directions. This Arabic phrase is one which is well known to Muslims, and it appears 7 times in the Quran. In reference to God, it reads, Yaqullahu kun fayakun. He says to it be, then it becomes, or then it exists, or then it will exist, right? The popular way to put this is he says be, and it is, right? God says be, and it is. Like I said, this phrase appears 7 times in the Quran, and there's also an 8th instance where almost the exact same phrase appears, only with the first verb in the perfect tense rather than the imperfect tense. The portions I wanted to focus on are these. These are slightly different, but they convey the same concept using the same verb root. In the Ge'ez text, God says, La yakun. He commands the thing in question to come into existence, and then the Ge'ez text states, Wakone, and it existed. In the Quranic Arabic text, God says kun, which is the verb to be in the imperative, and then the text states, Fayakun, then it exists, or then it will exist. At first glance, the way the verbs are rendered in these 2 different languages, they seem almost like they're rendered in the reverse, right? Because in the Ge'ez text, the command has the verb root with a ya prefix, conveying the imperfect tense, while in the Quranic Arabic text, it's the reference to the thing coming into existence after the command, which has the verb root with a ya prefix, conveying the imperfect tense. And likewise, in the Ge'ez text, the reference to the thing coming into existence has the verbal root as simply 2 characters, kaf nun, while in the Quranic Arabic text, it's the command which has the verbal root as simply 2 characters, kaf nun. And this is because the 2 languages take different approaches to conveying the imperative, which is to say the verb as a command. As was discussed earlier, the Ge'ez text conveys the imperative by putting a lam prefix, L prefix, on the imperfect rendering of the verb. In the Quranic text, the verb in the imperative here is simply kun, right? And as for the way the texts convey the thing having come into existence, the Quranic text uses the imperfect or uncompleted tense, as if to say it exists or it will exist, while the Ge'ez text uses the perfect or completed text, meaning it existed. And finally, before closing this video, I wanted to comment on the Ge'ez word for light, birhan. It's related to the Arabic word burhan. And today, the Arabic word is typically spelled with an extra letter, an alif, between the ha and nun. But here, I have the string of consonants as it appears in the Quran, without that explicit alif in the consonantal structure. In the Quran, it'll typically have a so-called dagger alif floating above the consonantal text. However, in the Quranic usage, the word means evidence or proof. For example, you may have heard many Muslims say, bring your proof if you are truthful. Bring your evidence if you are truthful. And that's a line which appears a few times in the Quran, and it employs the word burhan. Some have even proposed that the Quranic term is derived from the Ge'ez term, as if it originally started out as a Ge'ez term, which meant light, and then, maybe it moved through South Arabian into what would become the Quranic Arabic, but in a more colloquial sense of evidence or proof or something like that. Though I should be careful to note that there are others who disagree with that claim that the Quranic term is derived from the Ge'ez term, as both the root and the structure of that Quranic Arabic term are found in Arabic. But whatever the case, I'll stop here. I hope you found this examination of the Ge'ez text interesting. I may do more videos like this in the future. I'm actually thinking about making a short video on an interesting insight in the Ge'ez translation of Revelation 1:14. And I might even do a video on the Ge'ez translation of Deuteronomy 28:68. I've already done, a video on the Aramaic translation of that. But until then, any comments, questions, criticisms, or corrections are most welcome. And as always, God bless.